Hello there, indie football and sim football gaming fans. Thanks once again for returning for this third and final part of my breakdown of the football knowledge of the independent football games in 2020. The previous section of this critique of Maximum Football 2020 and Axis Football 2020 focused on elements of game strategy and play design that neither game really implements correctly, if at all. Now, I'm going to switch over from team strategy and artificial intelligence to individual player AI systems, the very AI systems that drive on-field gameplay. As I've said in the previous videos, even though these videos contain a lot of negative criticism of both games, I'm not making this content in order to bash Maximum or Axis as some sort of low-hanging fruit clickbait. I'm also not going to give the games a free pass, as some others have done, because at the end of the day, these games are competing in the simulation football space. If we're going to take these games seriously as simulation football games, then I firmly believe that we need to give them the same level of scrutiny that we would give to a game like Madden or NFL 2K or NCAA football or any other simulation football game, past or present. We can still provide this level of scrutiny while also respecting the fact that these studios are small and lack the resources of a company like EA or 2K, and we can set our expectations accordingly. It's still entirely possible to like either or both of these games, and to continue to support these games and studios, while still also recognizing the weaknesses and limitations of the games. As such, I create these critiques in the spirit of constructive criticism, and I hope that they are taken as such by my viewers and also by the game's developers, if those developers happen to stumble across these. Pathfinding and pursuit is going to be a complicated issue in any game that has 22 separate characters, all moving and interacting and colliding, while also still trying to operate as a unified, singular unit. In general, defensive pursuit in both indie football games is, I would say, pretty good. Defenders usually take pursuit angles that get them out ahead of the runner, assuming that the defender is fast enough to keep up with the runner to begin with. This is a far cry from Madden, which for years has had problems with defenders taking flat pursuit angles that don't allow those defenders to get out ahead of the runner to prevent walk-in scores. Now, this doesn't mean that the CPU-controlled defenders in Axis or Maximum are always going to take the right pursuit angles, or that they're always going to make the tackles. Speed plays a huge role, and defenders in both games still sometimes fail to keep in front of the runner and give up big gains in scores. Maximum Football has the particular problem of lacking a defensive strafe control, which makes user tackles in the open field much more difficult to make than they probably should be. Fortunately, computer-controlled defenders in this game are better at lining up their tackles.
Strafe and backpedal animations clearly do exist in Maximum Football, and the CPU players are able to use those animations. The human player just isn't able to access that animation set for whatever reason. It's not like they don't have buttons available on the controller.
Axis, on the other hand, does have a defensive strafe, and so making open field tackles is much easier for the user as long as the opposing runner doesn't win on a special move, in which case they can sometimes spin or juke right through the defender as if the defender's not even there. That's not a good look for a, quote, sim, unquote, football game, but at least the players aren't being shifted to make impossible plays. While pursuit is solid for the most part, obstacle avoidance in both games is highly suspect. Both games have problems with players getting stuck on each other when running across the field. The individual players just don't seem to have very good logic for avoiding collisions with the other players or for moving around obstructions, nor do they ever seem to recognize that their path is being obstructed and thus try to find a different route to their goal. This means that crossing receivers are exceptionally good at picking each other's defenders, allowing these receivers to get wide open. But it also means that these same receivers might get stuck on a strafing defender in a zone, which probably should be a penalty for defensive holding or pass interference, but the game never recognizes it as such. Receivers can even get stuck on their own blockers if they're running like a short drag or in route or something like that. These pathfinding and obstacle avoidance issues also contribute to the overpowered nature of outside runs in axis football. Pursuing linebackers and safeties will often get caught up on other players who are being blocked along the perimeter and then can't get to the edge to actually defend the run, even if they had the speed and appropriate pursuit angle to do so. Maximum has an issue in which running backs like to stand still when pass blocking. If the offense is in an I formation or single back formation, which prevents the QB from taking a normal 3, 5, or 7-step drop. The QB has to drop back at an angle to one side or the other in order to complete the drop back and get off the throw. In this situation, the running back really needs to just pick a side of the field and support the lineman blocking on that side. Don't just stand in the quarterback's way and screw with the drop back. Pass rushing and gap play in the interior line of scrimmage is also kind of a crapshoot in both games. Blitzing linebackers have a tendency to get stuck on the backs of their own defensive linemen, and offensive linemen in both games seem to engage in the occasional suction blocks. There's other weird oddities with the AI, such as this instance that I saw in which a defensive lineman beats a block, only to literally turn around in a circle backwards and re-engage himself with the same blocker who he just beat. I'm not sure if this is some kind of AI pathfinding issue that got the player confused and turned around, or if it's some variation of suction blocking in which the blocker's block rating beat the defender's break block rating and the defender decided to just run back into the block. With all these problems, it really is a good thing that neither of these games tries to put referee characters on the field, as that would probably only further compound the problem. Inconsistent blocking makes outside runs much easier than inside runs in both games. In fact, the outside running game with a decently speedy back may be overpowered in both games. Even though defensive pursuit down the field is generally good, defensive containment is awful. Pathfinding issues can also cause problems with the CPU running game. CPU runners have a hard time finding the right holes to run through, which makes the CPU run game much less effective. Maximum's runners have a frustrating habit of running east or west instead of getting upfield and gaining yards, which leads to a lot of tackles in the backfield and makes the game a lot easier to win than it probably should be. Sometimes I even see the running backs run around in circles in the backfield. It's pretty rare. I've only seen it happen a few times. A more consistent problem that I have with Maximum Football 2020 is that the quarterbacks and running backs frequently fumble pitches. Isn't directly related to pathfinding, but I guess is more of an issue with the pathfinding of the football itself. This seems to happen most often on plays created in the play designer, especially if you motion the back to like weird parts of the backfield. But I've also seen it happen in the pre-designed plays that are in the that were put in the playbooks by Canuck Play as well. So it's not unique to the play designer. Despite the predictable and pedestrian play calling that I discussed in the previous video, I will confess that the quarterback AI in both games is also generally pretty good at picking apart defenses. If a receiver is left open or uncovered, the CPU QBs in both games will often recognize it and get the ball to that player, unless the quarterback gets sacked or is forced to roll out or scramble first. But then again, neither game's QBs are perfect. They'll still occasionally fail to recognize an open receiver and will instead check down to an underneath route or to just take off running. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that sort of thing happens in real life. Real quarterbacks miss wide open receivers too. I do wonder if this is the result of both games actually programming in a series of read progressions for the CPU quarterback, such that if the receiver wasn't coming open when the CPU quarterback checks that read, he instead tries looking for another receiver, the next one in the progression. Or, I don't know, maybe it's just a random roll of the dice. It's really hard to tell without, seeing the source code or knowing more of what's going on in the back end. In either case, even though the CPU QBs are usually good at finding the open receivers, the fact that they aren't perfectly hitting every single open receiver every play keeps the game feeling fair and realistic. They're not playing like the stupid robo QBs that seem to keep coming back in mid-year patches every damn year in Madden. Even so, in Axis football, the ability of the CPU quarterback to find open receivers leads to my defense giving up huge yardage totals in the air almost every game. It is just really hard to effectively defend the pass in this game, and I don't know, if you've got any tips for me, I'm all ears. Maximum Football, however, does not have such a dominant passing game because, for some reason, the completion percentages of quarterbacks are just pathetically low. Quarterbacks routinely overthrow open targets in Maximum Football 2020, and even when the pass is on target, the receivers have a tendency to drop an excessive number of passes. This is true even with the catch modifier and route persistence sliders, both at 100. To be honest, I'm not even sure if these sliders do anything at all, as I've tested different values and don't notice much of a difference in how the players behave. I initially thought that the ridiculously low accuracy that I was seeing was a result of playing with a cupcake team in the College Dynasty mode. But, my quarterback isn't awful, right? He has a 72 overall rating, which, makes him a C-. That should be good for a 50% or better completion percentage, I would think. Instead, his season average is hovering around 40%, if that. The CPU team's quarterbacks aren't faring much better. I used the broadcast cam to watch the college playoffs and found that even the playoff teams, which ostensibly should have elite quarterbacks, weren't performing much better either. Their simulated stats were good throughout the year. This Columbus Beaver quarterback was throwing 86% on the season, which is really high for a quarterback at any level of football. But in the college playoff game that I spectated, he was 6 of 19 for 32%. All the other QBs in the spectated playoffs had similar numbers, even though their sim stats from the regular season had them all in the high 60s and 70s in completion percentages, which is perfectly reasonable. I've also seen better completion percentages when playing in the Canadian rule set instead of in the US Pro or college rule sets, so maybe these accuracy issues have something to do with the design of the US playbook's route concepts. I don't know. Are other people playing Maximum experiencing this as well? I can't imagine I'm the only person who's seeing these ridiculously low completion percentages. And even if this problem is limited to lower-rated quarterbacks and I just got unlucky in the games that I spectated, I still think that Canuck needs to do something about it, as I feel it hurts the game in several ways. First and foremost, the short underneath routes that the game doesn't implement correctly to begin with, see the first video in this series, and which I have the lowest completion percentages on, are exactly the kind of plays that a real football coach or offensive coordinator would call to try to help a struggling quarterback get into a throwing rhythm and give him some confidence. But even if you're throwing these routes at the right time to a receiver running in a straight line and who is open, the throws are still inaccurate or dropped by the receivers far too often, in my opinion. I found that I simply cannot rely on quick slants, outs, hitches, or even screens to the flats for relatively easy 4, 5, or 6 yard plays. I'm not saying that I want these plays to be automatic. That's a big problem in Madden that I've complained about for years now, but they should still at least be relatively reliable completions. In fact, the only players on my team that seem to be able to reliably catch passes are my tight ends. Heck, corner routes to tight ends might even be borderline exploitative in Maximum Football 2020 since they are so poorly covered by defenses. Corner routes to tight ends are also an overpowered play in Madden, by the way, so But in Maximum, I can't seem to complete passes to any other players, and I'm not sure what, if anything, I'm doing wrong. Am I doing the wrong controller inputs? Should I be throwing bullet passes instead of lob passes? Unlikely, since bullet passes result in the receiver stopping dead in his tracks and watching the ball sail over his head. Should I be throwing lobs instead of touch passes? Is the game's pass trajectories tuned for taller receivers? which is why my tight ends can catch passes, but my receivers are simply too short to reach these passes? Should I be recruiting taller receivers if I want more success in the passing game? Or is the game tuned for faster receivers, and my receivers are simply too slow to catch up to the ball placement in the air? I don't know, but if so, this shouldn't be a problem. The quarterback should be practicing with these receivers. He should know how tall and how fast they are and where he needs to put the ball. The second reason that I feel Canuck should be putting more emphasis on testing its game more thoroughly with lower-rated teams is that a lot of players who play college dynasties like to play them to rebuild weak teams. If YouTube Let's Plays are anywhere close to representing how players actually play their football games, then rebuilds of weak teams may even be the primary use case for a dynasty or franchise mode. Even if rebuilds are overrepresented by YouTube, I think it's probably still a pretty popular way to play these games. So Canuck and any other studio making a college football game should really be taking the time to test and verify that low-rated teams and low-rated players are still functional and playable. As it stands now, the complete unreliability of the passing game is the single biggest deterrent that I have to playing more of Maximum Football 2020. This problem was not present in Maximum Football 2018 or 2019. But it has absolutely killed my enjoyment of Maximum Football 2020. And again, I want to point out that I don't think that it is, in fact, a problem exclusive to lower tier teams, but either way, playing in poor conferences is still too easy because of this problem. These Rocky Mountain, Sunshine, or Stars and Stripes conference teams with overall ratings in the 60s and 70s simply cannot move the ball and create a competitive game. They can't run. They can't complete passes, they can't score, they can't make good decisions on special teams. Even with one of the worst overall rated defenses in the nation, it's still easy for me to completely shut many of these teams down. And I also have several big upsets against top-tier opponents under my belt, largely because of the same problems faced by these lower rated teams.
Axis football literally divides its teams into multiple tiers of competition, but yet it still has more competitive matches between teams in different tiers, thanks, in part, to much better quarterback and receiver play.
In fact, they may even be a little bit too accurate, and I've seen a lot of QBs have a ridiculously long range, but I'll take those problems over the 30% completion percentages of Maximum Football 2020 any day. Receivers in Axis Football are also much better route runners than the receivers in Maximum Football. This is probably due to the fact that Axis does not seem to have any concept of route persistence. You see, Maximum has this interesting gameplay slider called route persistence, which determines how closely and consistently the receivers stick to their assigned routes. I like the concept in principle, but I hate Maximum's execution of it. In order for a feature like this to really work, receivers in Maximum should have some kind of route running attribute rating. Maybe this is handled in the game by the awareness rating, but I really feel like it should be a separate rating that would really help separate average receivers from good and great receivers. In any case, if your QB is struggling in Axis, you can, in fact, reliably fall back on short and intermediate passing game to pad your QB's accuracy at the cost of a lower yards per completion. Just make sure that you're not pressing the throw button too early, because otherwise the quarterback's just going to throw downfield instead of throwing to where the receiver's actually supposed to go, as I mentioned in the first part of this series. Well, we've talked about quarterback play, so now let's switch to the other side of the ball. Defense, specifically the secondary and pass coverage. This is actually an area of the game that has some of the best highlights of both games' player AI systems, but also some of the worst problems. So let's try to take a look at both. First and foremost, I want to point out player awareness and reaction time, which I think is one of the strengths of both games. I am pleased to say that neither of these games seem to employ the psychic DBs that have been infamous in Madden throughout the last 10 years or so. Both games have decent head tracking for receivers and defensive backs, and they rarely, if ever, make a play on the ball if they are not looking back at it. DBs won't make interceptions with their backs turned to the ball, as we commonly see in Madden. Receivers and DBs also do not motion shift in order to line themselves up for a preordained catching animation or SWAT animation. If the receiver or DB cannot reach the ball, they won't catch it. This does possibly lead directly to Maximum's low completion percentage problem that I discussed in the previous section, but I'll take that little bit of realism over Madden's impossible physics any day. Even though physics and AI glitches still happen in both Axis and Maximum, they aren't happening by design in order to make certain outcomes happen, as is the case again with Madden. Or at least, I've never gotten the perception from either game that that is what they're doing. The delay in reaction time for defenders in both games means that certain pass concepts are easier to complete in these games compared to Madden. For example, hitting the seam between safeties in a post route against cover 2 or in an all-verts combination against cover 3 defense is a lot less dangerous in these games compared to Madden because the safeties won't instantly converge on the receiver to make the swatter interception. I would say that the defenders in both games do a really good job of handing off receivers between zones as well. They leave very little room, if any, to throw between the zones, meaning that the offense has to use combinations of routes to clear out those spaces on the field and create those gaps in the zone. This is true in both games, but I generally find that Axis is much more readable than Maximum, and it's much easier for me to keep visual track of what's going on down the field. In the past, I've complained that one of the biggest problems with earlier iterations of both Maximum and Axis was poor safety play and deep coverage. So I'm pleased to report that both games have improved in this regard over the last year or two, though problems do still persist. It's still far too easy for fast receivers to get behind the defense, even against cover 2, cover 3, or cover 4 shells. The poor accuracy and lower range of quarterbacks in Maximum does help to keep this problem in check. Similarly, the problem in Axis has been somewhat mitigated by the fact that QB accuracy and receiver catching ability seems to be changed in this year's version of the game so that it declines on deep throws. Even if the receiver is wide open or not even covered, with nobody between him and the end zone, there's still a strong likelihood that the QB will simply overthrow him or that the receiver will just drop the ball. Axis doesn't have particularly robust or believable catching animations. It is one of the weaker aspects of this game. So it basically comes down to a dice roll whether the ball sticks to the receiver for a TD or goes through his hands for a drop. I do feel like this could be further improved in Axis with a couple new animations and AI features. Number 1, I'd like to see more catching animations, including DBs and wide receivers fighting each other for positioning on the catch, and defenders attempting to make a play on the ball in the air, or receivers bobbling the ball. Number 2, I'd also like to see some underthrown balls as well, which would force the receiver to slow down or stop, or maybe even come back towards the QB in order to catch the pass. This would allow the defenders to catch up to the receivers in certain situations where there might have been a blown coverage, so that even if they do give up the deep reception on that blown coverage, they would still at least be in a better position to stop a score. Axis's defenders seem to err very heavily in favor of covering deep routes, which has the unfortunate side effect of leaving underneath routes wide open, especially along the sidelines. DBs give huge cushions to receivers running underneath routes, especially in those flats. Linebackers also have a really hard time covering tight ends and running backs due to speed disparities between players in the position groups. Running backs and tight ends can trivially beat most defending linebackers to the flats every time for uncontested catches. Even when explicitly running flat zone defenses, there is still a lot of open space for short and intermediate routes along the sidelines. This allows both the human and CPU offenses to move the ball pretty easily through the air. I will say that I do feel that this is still a huge improvement over Axis 18 and 19. Even though I'm still frustrated that my defense is always ranked near the bottom in the league in yards allowed, I would much prefer that my defense be playing this bend but don't break philosophy and giving up those underneath passes instead of getting beat over the top for instant touchdowns, as was the case in previous years. It's still a problem, but it doesn't come nearly as close to being an experience-ruining problem. I had wondered if my defense was ranking so poorly because maybe simulated games were being simulated with shorter quarter lengths and thus have less time to accumulate as many yards and points. I play with full 15-minute quarters in Axis Football thanks to its accelerated clock feature. The game does not show time of possession in the game stats, but I saw that teams in simulated CPU versus CPU games are running between 120 and 140 plays total, which seems about in line with the total number of plays in the matches that I'm user playing, and is also consistent with what I would expect from real football. I had wanted to try starting a new franchise with 1-minute quarters just to see what the sim stats would be like, but I couldn't find any way to globally change quarter length. Quarter length only appears to be able to be changed in the setup for an individual match. So I spectated a couple matches with the minimum length of 3-minute quarters just to see what would happen. Would the game simulate the other matches that week with the same quarter length that I had selected for my team's match? And the answer appears to be no. As far as I can tell, all simulated matches in Axis Football 2020 assume a default quarter length, probably 15 minutes, regardless of my own quarter length settings. Simulated teams were still combining for 120 to 140 plays per game. Quarterbacks were still throwing almost 40-ish passes, and running backs were getting 20 to 30 carries, all about consistent with what you would expect from an NFL game. This is certainly not the case in Maximum Football 2020, which shows me running a lot more plays compared to the other teams in the Dynasty League, even on 10-minute quarters, let alone 15. Reducing the quarter length to 7 minutes in subsequent seasons so that matches don't drag on as much due to the lack of an effective accelerated clock led me to running a similar number of plays compared to the CPU. This leads me to believe that Maximum is using some default quarter length of 5 or 7 minutes for its simulated games, regardless of the quarter length setting and with no option to change the simulated quarter lengths. NFL 2K5 back in the day had a setting in its franchise mode for the quarter length of its simulated games. I don't know why modern games don't have that setting. At the very least, you should be scaling your sim stats based on the quarter length of the games that the user is playing. Whatever, in any case, I digress. I'm supposed to be talking about defensive coverage AI. As for safety play in Maximum Football 2020, it overcompensates even more than Axis does. Safeties in Maximum will routinely back off 20 or 30 yards, even if none of the offensive receivers are going deep. Safeties will run themselves far out of the play and just stand there, watching the play from a safe distance, not actually covering anybody at all. Yes, it is true that it is the safety's job to keep the whole play in front of him, but this is not how you play safety in football.
But this right here, I mean, what is that safety doing? 21. That's not a half-field technique I'm familiar with. That's not a middle-field close technique I'm familiar with. He looks like he thinks they're punting.
You're still supposed to be in the play, covering somebody, or covering a part of the field where somebody is likely to go, or keeping yourself available for run support. You don't just sprint 30 yards ahead of the play and then park yourself where you'll never have any impact on the play at all. For the record, the reason that safeties do play like this in Maximum 2020 is because the game has, for several years, and as long as I've been playing it, had problems with safeties letting opposing receivers burn them deep. So Canucks' response was to just have the safeties sprint to their assignment, regardless of what is going on with the offense in front of them. Safeties in Maximum also have trouble with covering their specific sections of the field. This isn't so much a problem in the pre-made plays, but if you add a bunch of cover 3 and cover 4 concepts in the play designer, it will expose problems. Safeties will crisscross each other's zones or all flood one side of the field while leaving their actual assignments completely unoccupied. So while underneath coverage in Maximum is, pretty good, safety play, despite Canucks' attempts at improvements, is still abysmal. Compare Maximum safety play against this example of safety play in Axis. The CPU is playing a cover 3 shell against 3rd and long. I have a streak on the left and a deep post on the right. Notice how the defensive cornerback on my right hands off the R1 receiver to the deep safety. Then, instead of backing off 30 more yards and putting himself out of the play, he comes back down to cover any other intermediate or deep routes going along the right sideline. Yeah, sure, he is still just standing there, which again is not a particularly good look for simulation football. But if I were to, for example, throw to the square receiver, that corner would at least be in a position that he could play that pass. He isn't leaving 30 yards of open field between him and the deepest receiver on his side. The coverage is just good enough that I end up trying to run for the first and end up getting tackled short and have to punt. Even with the large cushions that defenders give in both games, they will still converge on underneath routes fairly quickly. They can sometimes break up the pass, or they will stop the receiver short of the line to gain. Maximum football is even more aggressive about shutting down underneath routes, as defenders in man coverage will jam the hell out of receivers, including tight ends. They also do a pretty good job of sticking tight to the receivers on these routes in man coverage, such that they can deflect the pass or hit the receiver and force a drop. One problem that does crop up with the zone coverage in Axis is that the defenders tend to stay in their zones a bit too rigidly. There's a misconception among the casual football audience that zone defenses have each defender locked to a specific position on the field. While this may have been true decades ago when zones were initially introduced and became popular, it isn't necessarily the case anymore. In modern real-life football defensive schemes, zone coverage basically becomes man coverage after the play starts.
So overall, when you really look at the structure of this coverage, it is a cover 3 zone, but most of the defense are playing those zones with man coverage principles.
The defenders are supposed to run with a receiver who runs into or through their zone, and then stay with that receiver until the defender can either hand off the receiver to another defender in the other zone, or the ball goes to another part of the field. Madden actually has this concept implemented in some of its zones, including its soft squat zone coverage, in which a flat zone defender transitions to man coverage if the wideout runs a streak. This type of zone coverage is also popular against bunch and other compressed passing formations, as it allows the defenders to break away and cover receivers that run into their zones of the field, rather than lining up man-to-man and stumbling over each other as the receivers cross. Neither game's zone coverage does this. If a receiver leaves the defender's zone, that defender will break off the coverage and return to the center of his zone. Sometimes he'll pass off the receiver to another zone defender if the receiver runs into the zone area of that other defender and that other defender isn't already covering someone. Other times, however, the receiver will run into an empty area of the zone and be completely uncovered. Running 3 or more receivers on verts down the field is basically a free touchdown against cover 2 because none of the underneath zones will follow the receivers and support the 2 safeties who are now outnumbered. The final major topic that I want to discuss in this series is the individual player's situational awareness, which, again, as you would probably expect, is very hit or miss. Let's start with the quarterback's willingness to take hits. Maximum has a QB slide mechanic, and CPU QBs will use it to avoid big hits and eliminate the risk of a fumble, especially if they've already passed the line to gain. In fact, Maximum has 3 separate buttons for diving, hurdling, and QB slide, yet still no buttons for a stiff arm or shoulder truck. Bleh. Axis, however, has no such slide mechanic. Quarterbacks, or any player for that matter, cannot slide to avoid being hit. QBs in particular have a high fumble rate, and there is nothing that you or the CPU QB can do to protect yourself from a fumble except for going out of bounds if you can even reach the sidelines before the defense gets to you. I have lost games of Axis because my quarterback fumbles on a scramble attempt because I had no way to make him slide. You can dive, but the fumble risk for diving is also very high. So if there's anybody close to you and they even touch you during the dive, you might fumble. Heck, even going out of bounds is harder than you would think in Axis football because the quarterbacks seem to slow down once they pass the line of scrimmage. I'm guessing this is a balance concession to prevent scrambling with the QB from being overpowered, but it is kind of annoying that my quarterback can outrun defenders in the backfield, but then as soon as he passes the line of scrimmage, he's just arbitrarily running at like 3/4 the speed and can easily be caught and tackled. Speaking of scrambling with the QB being overpowered, that is absolutely the case in Maximum.
Defenses are awful at containing quarterbacks in both of these games, but Maximum doesn't take the extra step of nerfing quarterbacks to make up for all this. Maximum supports a QB spy assignment for defenses, but in my experience it doesn't really work very well. The spying linebackers tend to just get stuck on blockers if the quarterback scrambles up the middle, and the spying linebacker fails to keep containment if the quarterback scrambles into the flats.
The CPU also does not perform particularly well when it comes to knowing their position on the field. CPU players in both games are a little bit too willing to give up on a play before reaching the line to gain, even on 3rd and 4th downs. They don't put up much of a fight to get to the first down, and this leads to the CPU punting a bit more than it should have to. Or worse yet, they'll turn over the ball on a 4th down. Okay, fine. In this particular case that I'm showing here, they're probably not coming back and winning because they're down by 22 inside of 4 minutes in the 4th. But if the CPU play calling logic is going to bother trying to convert a 4th down, you'd think the player logic would be on the same page and would put in more than a Jay Cutler level of effort. Players in both games also make little to no effort to recover their own fumbles. This, by the way, is also yet another problem that has plagued Madden for many years. In the case of Madden, it's because the offensive and defensive player involved in the tackle or fumble both get locked into cutscene-like animations before realizing that the play is still active and their in-game AI turns back on. In the case of Axis and Maximum, it seems to have more to do with the tackled player and defender kind of ragdolling and basically having their AI turned off and their animation system disabled.
As I mentioned earlier, Maximum even has frequent fumbles on simple toss plays.
When this happens, the QB just stands there and watches the defense fall on it. He makes absolutely no effort to go for the ball. The running back at least will try to dive for the ball, but they're really bad at doing it and almost always miss. I also find myself frustrated in both games with the inability to assign inside or outside leverage to my defensive backs in coverage. Axis allows me to shift my secondary. I can shift my corners and safeties up into press position or back to give cushions against deep threats, or I can shift safeties left or right to line them up better with their assignments or to an overloaded side of the field, but I cannot assign inside or outside leverage to the corners. This means that I cannot make them prioritize covering the sidelines against an offense's 2-minute drill, nor can I assign inside leverage if I'm expecting a slant or curl in a short yardage situation. Maximum Football's corners heavily favor inside leverage when defending passes in man coverage. DBs always line up with inside leverage when playing man coverage, which also acts as a dead giveaway for the player that the CPU defense is running man coverage. There is no way for the user to change this, which leaves many outside routes wide open. If the QB keeps the pass in bounds and the receiver is actually able to catch the damn ball, these are relatively easy completions. If you get a linebacker matched up on a speedier receiver, then these outside routes are especially dangerous, as long as the pass stays in bounds. There are also some times when players in both games do show some rudimentary situational awareness, and surprisingly, I notice a lot of them are happening on special teams. Like, usually you expect special teams to be the least polished part of the game, but actually in this particular instance, it seems to have a little bit more polish. First of all, kick return blocking in both games works surprisingly well. I really love how both of these games are good about creating these little seams that if you can hit one, you can break for a big return and maybe even a score. It's not like Madden where it feels like you get to the 25-yard line and then there's just a solid impenetrable wall of tacklers as every single one of them seems to break their blocks at the same time. I see lots of big returns and even returns for touchdown in both indie games. And it isn't just me making these big returns either. The CPU can break a big return as well because those seams happen on my kickoffs as well. Returners in both games seem to also know that kicking out of bounds results in a penalty, and CPU returners will let a kickoff go out of bounds in order to force that penalty. They aren't quite clever enough to put 1 foot out of bounds when they field the kick in order to force a penalty, but, I mean, hey, at least they are aware of the sidelines in these situations. Similarly, returners in both games will let the ball bounce into the end zone for a touchback rather than try to field it on the 5-yard line. But I have noticed that they don't seem to do this all the time. I do see my returner in Maximum occasionally attempt to field a punt inside the 10 or 5-yard line. Worse yet, if I don't start the play with user control of the returner, the game will not let me take control of him while the punt is in the air. As such, if I see that the punt would likely bounce into the end zone or is otherwise risky to attempt to field, I cannot move my returner away. I can't control him at all until he has caught the ball.
Though, if you're going to make the returner smart enough to let the ball bounce inside the 10-yard line, don't then screw that up by programming him to chase after the bouncing or rolling punt and then kick it into the end zone. Everybody on the return team needs to know to just get away if the punt is allowed to bounce.
Axis does kind of drop the ball in this regard by not supporting fair catches or kneeling in the end zone for a touchback at all. So the AI for such things is completely non-existent. Touchbacks are only triggered if the ball is unfielded in the end zone or if the returner runs out of bounds while still in the end zone. This is something that I'll do if my returner fields the ball deep in the end zone, but the CPU returners do not know to do that. CPU returners will run the ball out of the end zone even if they field it 7 yards deep. In their defense, if the ball goes 8 or 9 yards into the end zone, even the CPU returners in Axis do know well enough to let it bounce out of the back. But if the CPU returner is 6 or 7 yards deep, they'll run it out. If you have a strong-legged kicker, you can even exploit this foible of the AI to consistently pin the CPU deep in their territory by kicking the ball deep to the corner of the end zone. Because the CPU AI seems to have no concept that touchbacks are even in the rules of the game, the CPU returner will run the ball out of the end zone from that deep corner. With the extra hang time from kicking to the corner, your coverage team will have more time to get downfield, and you can reliably make the tackle inside the 20-yard line and maybe even inside the 15. Or the CPU will simply run out of bounds for a similarly short return. Maximum Football does have fair catches and kneel downs, but it might as well not have the fair catches at all. I've never seen a fumble or muffed return in Maximum Football 2020, so as far as I can tell, there is absolutely no risk to neglecting the fair catch and just fielding the ball. The potential reward is that you might break the initial tackle and gain positive yards. In fact, the only time that I ever saw a muffed return was in Maximum Football 2019, and it was ironically on a play in which I had called a fair catch. Blocking kicks in both games also seems to be borderline impossible. Maximum Football's defenders don't make any effort to block kicks at all. They frequently get close to being able to block, punt or a field goal, and even looks like they should absolutely be able to, but they don't have the situational awareness to reach out an arm or dive for the ball at all. In fact, I sometimes feel that the rushers will even run right through the field goal holder without actually colliding with him or blocking the kick. In Axis Football, I've tried all kinds of shifting my defense around to see if I could get some advantage or overload one side to allow me to, break free and block kicks, but so far, I haven't had it happen. I think I maybe had one field goal blocked in one instance, but I have no idea how it actually happened. So apparently it's possible, but it is exceedingly rare.
Wow, okay. I know that I said in the last video that I was confident that I would be able to keep this one in that 20 to 30 minute range, but it once again bloated up to almost 50 minutes. Sorry about that. Once again, as I went through footage and played both games to collect more footage, I kept noticing other things that I wanted to mention. For example, that entire rant about the low completion percentage of QBs for Maximum Football was a late addition, and I couldn't not talk about it considering how much it has impacted my enjoyment of the game. Despite going on for more than twice as long as I expected it to, there are still other things that I didn't even get a chance to talk about. I could have spent time talking more about blocking, and specifically the fact that offensive tackles don't get deep enough in pass blocking to create an effective pocket. I didn't get to talk at all about issues with the blocking and execution of screen passes, and there's also a lot of other weird issues with blocking logic that could probably be a whole video onto their own. But I guess I have to save something for next year's videos, eh? Well, with that in mind, be sure to like and subscribe to see new content that I release, and please consider supporting me on Patreon for previews of upcoming content, for early access to select content, and for the ability to vote in polls of upcoming content. I really do hope that both of these games can work out many of their more egregious issues. I do worry about the long-term viability of both of these games, considering the recent news of new football games from 2K and EA. Both Maximum and Axis likely owe a lot of their modest success to the fact that they are filling empty niches left behind by the dearth of football video games during Madden's stagnant monopoly of the past, 10 to 20 years, depending on who you ask. But with new AAA football games on the horizon, Axis and Canuck are going to have a hard time competing. Maximum, in particular, may find itself in trouble with EA planning to release next-gen college football games within the next couple of years. If that EA game brings back the in-season recruiting of its predecessor, which Maximum Football borrowed heavily from, then Maximum will have to do a lot more to try to separate itself from EA's product, lest it be perceived as just the poor man's college football game. Or, I don't know, maybe Canuck will have to embrace Maximum Football's original identity as a Canadian football game and lean harder into that. Axis, I would think, is probably in a better position. It's a more polished product with a unique and novel league structure that makes it feel distinct from Madden, college football, and also from any game that I foresee 2K being likely to develop. Nevertheless, both games are going to have to get a lot better and find ways to innovate within a relatively short time period if they want to continue to be relevant as AAA football games start getting released. 2022 or 2023 is looking like it might be a bit of a renaissance for football video gaming. In addition to the monolithic Madden, we're going to have EA publishing another college football game for the first time in almost 10 years. 2K will also be returning with one or more arcade NFL licensed games, and maybe eventually a simulation NFL title. And hopefully both Axis and Maximum will still be around providing budget indie titles and gently nudging those AAA competitors to provide a better product. I'll see you next year.
With the toss. Fourth down. The coach showed some wisdom and football knowledge on that call. Take what the defense gives you and live to fight another day.